Hello and welcome to Tetch Talk. I'm Tetch, and today we're going to talk about something a bit close to my heart, which is net neutrality. And with me today, I have a fellow journalist, somebody who has also been covering this topic for a little bit longer than I have, about 20 years, in fact, Karl Bode. So, Karl, welcome to Tetch Talk. We're here to talk about net neutrality. So why don't you tell the people a little bit about yourself real quick?
Hey there. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I am a freelance technology reporter and have been for the better part of 2 decades. I've written for a long list of outlets from Ars Technica and Vice to Techdirt. I also do some work now for the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, which is a nonprofit focused on combating concentrated monopoly power. But my beat for most of my time has been telecom and broadband access from a consumer rights perspective. So that's where I am. And net neutrality, I've been writing about for pretty much the entire time I've been doing this job. It's the subject that never never seems to culminate in anything and never seems to end. So we're here once again with the FCC's announcement that they're going to once again be restoring those rules in the hopes of keeping giant telecom monopolies from abusing their market power to disadvantage consumers and competitors.
Good luck with that. I mean,
it's an uphill climb.
How long have we been going with this? I mean, let's go right the way back, and I think it was the Hushaphone was the thing that really started net neutrality, and that was what was it, 1948?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back a long time. It goes back to some of the debate goes back to the telegraph era, but it really took off in 2004 when the broadband providers really what's a fight about net neutrality is really, to me, a fight about whether you want a government regulator to have any kind of authority over telecom monopolies, and that battle really took off in 2004 when the FCC started to want to reclassify broadband providers as an information service versus a telecommunications service. So that set the stage for this debate long ago. Basically, broadband providers want government to basically be a marionette to their interests. They don't want any consumer protection. They don't want to be told where they can deploy service. They don't want to be told how much service should cost. So that 2004 ruling by the FCC to reclassify broadband providers really got this fight going. And the problem with stripping away regulatory oversight of telecom is it's a natural monopoly. So you just don't have competition in most of these markets. So when you eliminate competition and then you eliminate regulatory oversight, the end result is really not pretty. It's high prices. It's terrible customer service, arguably some of the worst of any company in the United States, these broadband providers. It's slow speeds, it's high costs. The result is fairly obvious. So to me, net neutrality has kind of been a proxy debate for a debate over monopoly power and whether you believe government has a role in trying to combat monopoly power and protect consumers or not. So that 2004 ruling was really started. And then the FCC tried several different times to impose net neutrality rules that were kind of sloppy and half-hearted.
Yeah.
That the court said they didn't have the authority to pass.
Yeah. So it all started. You listen to a Republican, they'll say 2010 and then 2015 were the whole kind of paradigm changes from the Democrats trying to publicize and steal away the thing and give it away. But prior to 2002, all internet connections, dial-up, cable, and DSL were all Title II.
Yeah.
As I say, and then in 2002, they reclassified cable to an information service.
Right.
Which you can kind of see because you got your TV down it, and TV is the classic information service. Right? And then, hey, that's cable. They've got Title. They're Title I now, information service. We're Title II under higher restrictions. We want the same restrictions as cable because that's just fair.
Yeah.
Right. That was the basic argument at the time.
Right. That's what they claim. Yeah.
And so that was the shift then from Title II to Title I for all the internet, as you say. It started in 2004 and then was finalized in 2005. Wasn't it, I believe?
Yeah.
And then we get to this wonderful set of establishment rules for net neutrality. And I just want to, if I can find my document in this order from the FCC. It's a document whose number I have committed to memory. It's 05151. And it says, to ensure that broadband networks are widely deployed, open, affordable, and accessible to all consumers, the Commission adopts the following principles. Okay, so we'll look at each of the points on this document and let's discuss them one by one. To encourage broadband development and preserve and promote the open and interconnected nature of the public internet, consumers are entitled to access the lawful internet content of their choice. That's right. Sounds like a really good rule to me, right?
Yeah.
A good basic rule.
It's important to note that this was a Republican push, by the way. Net neutrality is often framed as if it's all, crazy liberals who support it. But the fights really began when the Republican FCC, President Bush's first FCC chair, started talking about preserving internet freedoms in this way. So yeah, this was rooted in Republican thinking that kind of gets lost in some of the narratives about it.
The second point is to encourage broadband deployment and preserve and promote the open and interconnected nature of the public internet. Consumers are entitled to run applications and use services of their choice, subject to the needs of law enforcement. Yeah. That, you can use any software you want. I mean, we get the bundling. There was a lot of restrictions with Vonage was one of the ones.
But ISPs were starting to do things like block competing voice over internet services. They were starting to use their gatekeeper power in ways that, disadvantaged competitors who wanted to compete with them. In wireless, you had Verizon blocking GPS apps because they wanted you to pay for their GPS app. You had Verizon blocking mapping apps early on because they wanted people to use their Verizon apps. So this was clearly something they had an eye on. It's clear they wanted to abuse their market power to drive consumers to their products and away from competitors' products. So, I mean, this has been a long-standing quest to just have them play as dumb pipes. Give me a decent broadband connection. Keep your ambitions, your anti-competitive ambitions away from it. It's a reasonable request to start with. The problem is that the FCC, when they first started pushing real net neutrality rules in 2010, is they tried to do it without properly reclassifying ISPs, as telecommunication services again under Title II. So that's where the fracas. And the courts didn't like that and shut down the 2010 rulings. So they came back in 2015 and did it the correct way. Then Tom Wheeler, FCC boss Tom Wheeler, said, all right, if we're going to impose these net neutrality rules, we should do it in a way that's legally supportable. We should reclassify ISPs once again as information services, as telecom services under the Communications Act. And the courts have repeatedly said that they were within their right to do that. That's a fine way to approach these rules. The problem is that in 2017, the Trump FCC comes in and says, all right, we're going to discard that entirely. After, a decade, 15 to 20 years of discussion, they just came in and they did it in a very sleazy way. The broadband industry was caught hiring proxy PR firms that would use dead and fake people to stuff the FCC comment section with support for this repeal of net neutrality rules.
And buying off fake nonprofits as well, sort of.
Fake consumer groups.
Yeah.
And again, to me, the fight here isn't really even about net neutrality anymore. Net neutrality is a good principle. It's a good concept. The idea that your ISP should not screw with you when you're trying to access content of your choice and not be not leverage their monopoly power. But again, it's a proxy discussion, a very wonky policy proxy discussion. For me, what is really a debate about the symptoms of monopoly power. And historically, the FCC does not do a very good job policing telecom monopolies. So in 2017, they convinced the Trump FCC to basically dismantle. They not only convinced the Trump FCC to dismantle the rules that the FCC had created with the court's sanction, they tried to claim that in the repeal that states could no longer protect broadband consumers. So again, you see the goal here isn't net neutrality. The goal is no government oversight of natural monopolies. And that ends badly. You can look through history of every market and see that when you eliminate competition and regulatory oversight, the result is not great, especially for the end user and the consumer.
So point 3, To encourage broadband deployment and preserve and promote the open and interconnected nature of the public internet, consumers are entitled to connect to their choice of legal devices that do not harm the network.
Yeah.
So this goes to another topic that the FCC have taken a whiff at and missed, which is set-top boxes, for instance, as well.
Yeah, they attempted in wireless as well. Yeah.
Yeah, you can bring your own cable modem. You can bring your own DSL modem to connecting. You're not tied into the predatory pricing of a Comcast.
Yeah, and you can bring your own phone that you bought to your wireless provider. You know, it was like pulling teeth for decades to get Verizon to finally let you bring your own phone to their network. You know, before you had to buy the Verizon phone loaded with the Verizon bloatware, loaded with terrible Verizon apps that everybody hated. You know, that was their goal. It was very obvious that was their goal. So when people say that net neutrality, you know, like people that oppose consumer protections often say net neutrality is a solution in search of a problem. That's just not true. It was obvious these companies all had these grand ambitions to become far more involved in what devices you use, what content you view, what sites you can access, at what speeds. I mean, this was very clearly their agenda. So I do believe net neutrality rules are important. But again, I just think net neutrality tends to be a proxy debate over the real problem, monopoly.
Yeah. And then to encourage broadband development, deployment even, and preserve and promote the open and interconnected nature of the public internet. I think that's a stock phrase, I guess. But consumers are entitled to competition among network providers, application and service providers, and content providers. So that goes again to the monopoly broadband you were thinking, but also to zero rating in many ways as well.
Yeah, that was another big debate. You know, if the imposition of usage caps was a big part of the debate, you know, that your broadband provider can impose technically unnecessary usage caps. There's no real function for them technically on a network. You're supposed to design your broadband network simply to handle max load capacity. The usage caps are basically their way of charging you extra money for the same service. But then if they come in and say that, okay, usage caps only apply when you're using a competitor's service or competitor's devices and not our devices, that's, you know, that's an unfair, that's a tilting of the playing field. That's something else that from Carter phone era, they were trying to stop providers from doing. Luckily for us, a lot of these companies are not very innovative. Verizon is really terrible when it comes to like developing their own video services or apps. Like they're always terrible. So I mean, we've dodged some bullets just by the fact that a lot of these telecom companies can't innovate particularly well. But still, the ambition was very clear, and I do think it's important to have some guidelines that protect consumers and competitors. So I support net neutrality generally. But I like to bring the conversation back to monopoly power just because I think it's gotten lost in the policy weeds. And I think it's useful for the telecom giants to frame the conversation in these wonky, detailed, legalistic 20-year-old legal debates because people just get bored, right? The public gets bored. And they often forget that the real problem is this monopoly power being abused in the first place. So that's where we're at.
So you're right about it being a very, very boring topic. In fact, John Oliver, in one of his pieces, said, you know, we're about to talk about some kind of wonky network policy. And, oh, now you've gone to sleep.
Yes, net neutrality. The only two words that promise more boredom in the English language are featuring Sting. And hearing people talk about it is somehow even worse.
As anticipated, the notice proposes to ground the net neutrality rules in Section 706 of the Telecommunications Act of 1996.
Oh my God, that is the most boring thing I've ever seen. That is even boring by C-SPAN standards.
But then he brought some punch and pizzazz to it, and then a phrase that still sticks in my mind to this day.
Yeah. I think, didn't he call the FCC boss a dingo? Yeah, I think, yeah.
Yeah, it was the FCC boss at the time.
Well, when Tom Wheeler came in, he was a former cable and wireless lobbyist. So the assumption was that this was just another revolving door lobbyist, you know, that was going in 2014 that was going to come in and do the same stuff we've seen from the FCC, which is pretty feckless, performative regulatory oversight of giant telecoms.
The president has picked Tom Wheeler, a former top lobbyist for cable and wireless companies, to be the next chair of the Federal Communications Commission.
Yes. The guy who used to run the cable industry's lobbying arm is now running the agency tasked with regulating it. That is the equivalent of needing a babysitter and hiring a dingo. Thanks for stopping over. Just make sure they're in bed by 8. There's $20 on the table for kibble. So please don't eat my baby.
But then he surprised everybody. He actually sat down, he talked to experts, he talked to policy experts, and they told him very clearly that if you want to impose net neutrality rules, you have to have it under the proper legal framework, which is classifying ISPs as telecom providers, which they, and so he did that. Right. And the court said that is fine that you did that, and then the Trump FC comes in and just listens to AT&T and Comcast and wipes it all out. Under a lot of really dodgy claims that net neutrality rules had stifled broadband investment, which you'll still see parroted today, that the net neutrality rules that barely survived and were barely enforced stifled all kinds of broadband investment. That's their big argument. But when you look at the data, it's completely false. Did not happen. But if you look and read any major news article about net neutrality today, you'll see that claim parroted usually multiple times in a story. Mainstream stories will cite this just completely credibly, that net neutrality stifled broadband investment, and it's just not true. Because again, they don't really even care about the net neutrality aspects of it. Their goal is to create a regulator that has no teeth, that sits there nodding kind of dumbly, does some of the basic non-controversial engineering stuff on the side, but never wanders into consumer protection, because they don't want anybody disrupting their monopoly power.
Advocates should not be talking about protecting net neutrality. They shouldn't even use that phrase. They should call it preventing cable company f***ery, because that is what it is.
And they've had a pretty good run here. They kept the FCC from the Trump era to now has basically been without the voting majority to do much of anything. It's basically been a show agency when it comes to consumer protection. And wiping away net neutrality was kind of a final swipe at a multi-decade effort to have the FCC be kind of a fangless, feckless agency that's there mostly for performance sake when it comes to consumer rights. And I still believe that's the case, even though this FCC has announced that they are going to restore the rules. I don't think rules matter that much when you don't have the political courage to stand up to these companies. So we'll see what happens. I'm glad they're restoring it, because I think the Title II reclassification gives them authority to do other consumer protection stuff, like finally fine wireless companies for the decades in which they were hoovering up your location data and selling it to any idiot with a nickel, and then not securing it. The FCC has been trying to pursue a wrist slap fine on that front for at least the better part of 5 to 10 years and 5 years. And they've struggled because they lack the authority. They're also trying to implement, some cybersecurity standards for industry. In terms of making sure devices have privacy and security. And that, too, is going to be helped by the fact that the FCC restored its authority. So I believe it's the right move. I just have my doubts that they'll actually enforce rules.
Well, performative art is one of the things the FCC has become somewhat known for in recent years, and none more so than, let's put it bluntly, the face we'd all like to punch, Ajit Pai.
Yeah.
And his extremely stupid mug.
Yeah, the big mug.
Yes. Ajit Pai is the kind of guy who has a fun, oversized novelty mug, and he is really proud of it. Because here he is showing it off to a reporter. Here he is showing it off to his Twitter feed. And in his first speech to his staff as commissioner, he said, "I love walking into my office, pouring about a gallon of coffee into my infamous Reese's Peanut Butter Cups mug and starting my day."
Yeah, well, not that big. I mean, this is a little
Reese's
thing.
Not his face, his coffee cup.
Yes. One of the things I used to actually love to do every single comment I used to submit to the FCC at that point was, I have a big tea mug of my own, so 40-ounce thermal barrel mug thing. And every single submission, I would take a photo of me drinking a cup of tea out of the mug and put it right on page 2, the title page, and I'd have an about the thing, and I'd make sure there was a color photo of me drinking tea from my bigger than his and not some corporate tat mug.
Yeah,
just
very
while
nice.
smirking, usually wearing like a net neutrality or something kind of T-shirt on it, just so that every time he looked at that submission, he would see that and maybe feel a little bit more inadequate.
Yeah, right. Yeah. That was a very frustrating era for consumer rights folks because, they'd spent really better part of 15 years, like really trying to hammer this out and do it the right way. And Ajit Pai, Trump's FCC boss, Ajit Pai, comes in and just basically demolishes it completely with just the most artificial bullshit logic. Just false claims about how it stifled broadband investment, how it hurt free speech, and they're still doing it to this day. They basically they're looking for any reason they can to basically make the FCC as weak and powerless over AT&T, Verizon, and Comcast as possible. That's always been the goal. It gets muddied in press coverage to an absurd degree. I read most press coverage. I can't even notice when they bother to say that there are monopolies or that they cause problems. It's not even mentioned. As of 2020, my group Institute for Local Self-Reliance found that something like 83 million households lived under a broadband monopoly where Comcast was their only provider. And the outcome of that power is obvious everywhere you look, and yet here we were watching the Trump FCC come in and strip away the tiny bit of authority that the one already pretty weak regulator had and trying to sell it as if it was some quest for internet freedom. The rhetoric was delusional and the end product is obvious.
But it is I say good. It is a long tradition at the FCC. As you said, it's been done for a long time. They literally did the same thing, as I say, with the thing that started all this, the Husher phone. In 1951, the FCC made a ruling that the Husher phone was damaging and deteriorous. I can't say the word. It was bad for the sound quality of the phone. It was deteriorating call quality.
Yeah.
And so they banned it for that reason, even though a month later, they showed scientific data showing that it actually improved sound quality and everything like that. And they said, no, this is bad for things, because they wanted to keep the telecom company, AT&T, in charge of the monopoly of the phone, literally the phone handset, because a lot of people don't realize that until the 70s, I believe it was, or the 60s at least, the telephone itself belonged to AT&T.
Right. Yeah. You had to rent it, right? You had to pay some additional surcharge, and you only had one choice of phone, and you had to buy it from your company. That was the history they came from, and that history was really rooted in all their arguments about net neutrality. We are the phone company. All we say is correct. Don't question our authority. Use the devices we say, or else terrible things will happen. That's always been their legacy. That's always been their tack. So. Again, when I see people try to pretend that this isn't a real problem or that this is a regulatory solution for something that's not real, I think it's a little delusional and it disregards history.
Yeah, because from that ruling and the later Carter phone ruling, which was a radio intercom link, we ended up getting the ability to add in our own devices to the telephone line, which then led to answer phones. It led to fax machines, and then it led to modems.
Yep.
And then you saw those modems, we would not have the internet as we have now.
Yep. And then, like I mentioned earlier, you saw the same exact fight break out when wireless companies tried to restrict what wireless phones you could use and what apps you could use. It was the same fight. And this is just an extension of that. So in that sense, net neutrality is, you're right, it's, half a century of ongoing debate over how we actually try to enforce this.
Yeah. You think 70 years and they'd have learned by now. That,
you would think.
They actually end up getting better. I mean, you look at your phone bill, a telephone service, nobody gets a telephone. I still have a telephone line. I still have a hard line. Yeah. But it's $30 a month. My internet connection is, another $80, $100. Yeah. On top of that, they're getting more money from me from the internet, a lot more that they tried to ban than they would have done from getting a phone call.
Yeah. And once you're connected, it costs them very, very little to provision those lines, especially now as fiber deployment gets cheaper and network gear prices plummet and there's more sophisticated network management tools that can handle every bit of congestion on the line. It's absurd. So most of my time now is spent writing about, local towns and cities that are building their own broadband networks because they've grown tired of, federal incompetence and monopolies just kind of not upgrading them or providing affordable service.
And indeed, you just wrote about one just the other day, a startup in New York Mesh.
Yeah, New York, Mass. There's a bunch of local activists who basically go around guerrilla installing wireless antennas on top of buildings to ensure that low-income folks in the city can afford access. Which again, they wouldn't. None of these efforts would be required if we had properly tackled telecom monopoly power, because you'd have rules in place that guided competition to market. You wouldn't need, it's nice to have the FCC to have its consumer protection authority, but you wouldn't need net neutrality rules, strictly speaking, if we had functional competition, because ISPs would be scared away from behaving badly in these ways just by the fact that you could switch to another provider. The fact that you can't switch to another provider and you're stuck on Comcast is the core problem. Once again, hate to be redundant, but that's where I'm at in my thinking.
I'm sorry, sir. If you need it now, perhaps you should switch to another cable company. Oh, there's not another cable company, is there? Oh, that's right. We're the only one in town. Well, any luck? No, just the usual cable company stuff.
At the time of the 2007, I did the Sandvine test that brought all this back to the public consciousness in 2007, which found that second rule was entitled to run applications and use services of their choice. Comcast was blocking BitTorrent use. They were using a hacker system, a man-in-the-middle attack, to send reset packets to either side. So they'd sit in the middle, and then they'd send to that one, said, no, he said, cancel the connection, and then, no, he said, cancel the connection to the other, and they stop you from using the BitTorrent.
And then when they were caught, they lied about it several times early on. Their first,
yes.
This is, they literally said this is not happening. When we had technical evidence that they were basically, screwing with people's BitTorrent uploads, they tried to deny it.
Yeah, it was actually my very first assignment when I started working at Torrent Freak. One of the first things I got given was, here's this research project. We're not quite sure, can you look into this sort of thing? So because I'd been doing BitTorrent research at that point for a couple of years, and so did that. And then when the EFF and EP double checked my figures, because I'm just some weird British guy living in Georgia, like that gives me credibility. But that they checked it, it's right, and that started a whole set of investigations with the FCC. But Comcast again didn't play fair. They would hire seat warmers to fill in the hearing so that nobody could speak or testify.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah. There was I've forgotten more of the tricky shenanigans that they pulled than I can even recall. So many instances where they lied about something or tried to distort the public record, or that Comcast thing really brought transparency to the forefront. If you do buy a broadband line from your provider, you should be told, is there any weird restrictions on this? Is anything throttled? What's being throttled? Which sites can I access? Which services will be artificially restricted? That's not asking a lot, that your broadband provider, at the bare minimum, be transparent about the line that you bought. I don't think that's a lot to ask.
No, it's not. At the time I was living under a monopoly, I had Bell South, which at the time it was being bought by AT&T. And one of the conditions for the purchase, AT&T was told by the FCC that they must upgrade all of their users. At the time, I had the top package, which was a whopping 6 megabits down and half a megabit up on DSL.
Yeah,
got that when I moved into that house in 2007, right before I started this research. And when I left that house in 2014. I met the guy, one of the local AT&T guys, 2008, and he said, "Yep, we got the fiber in at the office in Covington, Georgia, which is one of the filming kind of meccas now. That's Yollywood, where they're filming all of the films and stuff. But yeah, we got the fiber in the office. We were about to start rolling it out to install it, as we're supposed to. And So when I moved out of that place, 2014, want to guess what my speed was?
Same.
That's right. It was still 6 megabit down and half a
Yeah.
megabit up, and I was still paying $75 a month for it. The exact same as I was in 2007. Yeah,
That is what they
didn't
call
bother doing
free
it.
market innovation at Comcast. Yeah.
Yeah, they didn't. Well, it was AT&T. I mean,
Oh,
they
right.
didn't do
Yeah.
any upgrades at all. The entire county was entirely AT&T only. They were the
Yeah.
only provider in the entire county. Cable didn't want to know because it was a rural county. It was where they filmed My Cousin Vinny. That's
Yeah.
how, you know, they didn't want those Utes to get on their internet connections.
Yeah. Here in Seattle, I could throw a rock at the center of the city, and I still only have Comcast as my only provider. Capped Comcast service.
Ooh. I'm lucky that Charter, who I'm with, Spectrum, whatever they want to call it these days, because of FCC rules when they took their Time Warner merger, they couldn't put on caps, although that's either about to expire or just expired.
I believe it just did. Yeah, I believe. Yeah. They've said they're not
So
going to pursue it, but I would expect that they will eventually.
I'm not looking forward to that. I go through easily a terabyte or more a month.
No, that was a big debate. You know, broadband caps, especially on fixed connections, are pointless. They do not help manage congestion. They don't do the things that ISPs claim. They eventually, so many people pulled out data saying that those usage caps don't actually do anything, that they just stopped explaining them at some point. So if you see a broadband provider announce usage caps, they won't even give like a technical justification anymore. It'll be some kind of bizarre wordplay where they try to claim that, you know, to meet the needs of our consumers or to provide a better service, we're going to artificially restrict your line with limits that if you pass, you'll have to pay us even more money for a service that's already overpriced by international standards. So, you know, I'd like to see the FCC tackle that stuff. You know, that's the kind of stuff I'd like to see. A real FCC would be tackling those issues pretty tough. And this FCC has said they're going to examine it, and I think they launched a new investigation into it, but I would be very surprised if anything comes of it. Despite ample evidence that this is price gouging. You know, this is nickel and diming and price gouging, and in any functioning government, you would have some policymakers at least saying, you know, this is not going to pass. You're ripping off captive customers, you know. But we don't have that. So this FCC, even the Biden FCC, you know, which has improved on telecom issues to the Trump FCC, can't. I did a research. They literally can't acknowledge that monopolies exist or cause problems. If you go back and look at any of their speeches over the last 10 years of FCC officials, commissioners, it's really hard to find one that even acknowledges that monopolies exist and cause harm. And if you're not able to do that, you're not going to be enforcing any of the rules you have on your books. I'm not particularly impressed with the U.S. telecom regulators. I haven't been for a long time. I think it's a lot of show. So again, it's good that the FCC is restoring net neutrality because it gives the agency some authority to do things if they wanted, even though they've put forbearance on it so that a lot of the, the forbearance makes sure that they can't do things like rate regulation with these changes. They can't do a lot of the things like demanding that companies provide lower services. So these rules do have limits on them in terms of how they can use them, but they're still helpful for an FCC that deals with wireless privacy and other issues.
But Karl, we've had no net neutrality rules now for the past 4 or 5 years, and the sky hasn't fallen like we were told it was going to.
Yeah. The reason for that is
why were we so wrong?
Yeah, well, the entire West Coast came in and imposed state-level net neutrality laws. So a company like Comcast saw that immediately happen after the repeal. They're not going to implement a bunch of anti-competitive shenanigans across their footprint because they'd run afoul of the attorneys general across the entire West Coast. So they've generally tried to be on their best behavior. But I've lost track of the number of people that claim, just because net neutrality was repealed and the internet didn't immediately explode in a bright rainbow of chaos and screaming, that must have meant that the repeal didn't matter. I'm like, no. For one, they didn't behave badly because states passed net neutrality rules. For two, the national attention in the press about the potential for it, I think, caused them to rethink some things pretty wisely, as it turns out. So yeah, that's where we are. And we're back to that again. The whole debate is refired back up in the press. Do we need net neutrality? Do we not need net neutrality? And lost in the conversation is that net neutrality is a very small part of the overall conversation.
And there's also that this exact thing was going to happen. Companies don't want to spend out, 20, 30, 40 million on network infrastructure to do this kind of management if they know that, the Biden administration is going to come in and put the rules back in and all that thing's going to be tossed into the trash can.
Well, they're so heavily subsidized already, they've received countless billions of dollars to wire every last corner of America. And yet, coincidentally, every year we're having the same debate about why we still have people who don't have access, or why, even in like urban Cleveland or urban Detroit, why are these people not upgraded to next generation fiber? It's, we've been throwing billions of dollars at you for the better part of 30, 40 years now. And it's always coincidentally and strangely just never quite completed. Always needs another additional $10 billion in taxpayer subsidies to ensure that people can get access.
Yeah, I mean, there was, I believe, some kind of plan that was supposed to get something like, like a 0.5 gigabit synchronous connection by, I think the plan was 2010.
Yeah, there's been several times where the FCC or the White House comes out and says, this is our big broadband plan to get everybody upgraded to decent, affordable connectivity by 2005 or 2010 and 2015. And every single time the deadline comes and goes and it doesn't happen. And the press has this weird amnesia. Policymakers have a weird amnesia that we've run this route, Someone like me who's been on the same beat for 20 years is really an anomaly in journalism, because it's very hard to make a living in the United States as a journalist anymore, unless you've got a trust fund and a lot of Ivy League connections. It's really quite difficult to do. So you get a lot of people who are new to a beat, and the net neutrality debate is so politically complicated and wonky with so much history and so much legal fighting that like a new Reuters reporter who's come in to cover it is of course not going to really understand the details and nuances of every last thing that happened, and they're not going to communicate that to readers by proxy. So again, this week when I was reading the restoration of net neutrality news reports, I was amazed about most of the stories on this do not mention all the sleazy things that industry did to get those rules repealed. B, they don't mention that there's a monopoly problem in telecom in the first place that causes this, and it drives me a little batshit at this point. Reading this coverage of this issue, because it's so superficial and shallow, and it's been a real failure in the press, I think, to make it clear that the real issue is monopoly power.
My connections kind of okay. I don't know why I'm on a wide connections. I don't know why my connection's messing up. I mean, I'm supposed to be on a wide connection. I'm supposed to be nice and fast, but I don't have any options, and it's kind of chopping and changing. You think with some competition I could get them to fix it, and
you would think. Oh,
I'm sorry, our company doesn't work that way. You want me to give you the number of a different cable company that can... Oh wait, we're it, aren't we?
Yeah, I have a 300 megabit connection with Comcast, and it still kicks out a lot.
Now this is supposed to be something like 600 down and a whole 12 up. It's one of those stupidly asymmetric connections that just makes no sense at all.
They're supposed to change that. They've got some full duplex DOCSIS technology that's supposed to address that. But again, the incentive for them to actually deploy that out with any speed doesn't exist, because they have no competition to drive them to do that. So here we are again.
Well, luckily, they last year Windstream put out some fiber apparently in this neck of the woods. So I can hope. I can look at their prices, see what they're like.
Some of the phone companies that neglected fiber upgrades are finally like, okay, we have no choice. They put it off for years and years. They got taxpayer subsidies. They half-assed it, and now they realize that if they want to continue to exist as a telecom company, they can't be selling people, DSL from 2006, with usage caps. It's so
and. And those subsidies, you say, they're usually Title II subsidies at that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So they'll take Title II.
Yeah, that was one
connection.
I think Mike at TechDirt had a couple articles about that. How they would whine about Title II when it was convenient for them. They liked the classification when it brought them huge unaccountable subsidies, or when it brought them perks on deployment. But then they didn't like it the second somebody vaguely suggests that the FCC should protect consumers from monopoly power. They get all skittish, all terrified about how, and started talking about all manner of unforeseen terribles if we gave the FCC the authority to actually police their bad behavior, which I might add they still haven't done. One of the arguments I see against net neutrality a lot is that the FCC will somehow run amok. This FCC will run amok and start imposing hard-handed price regulations and start doing stuff that impedes the free market. And that's never been a risk with this FCC. You can look back at 40 years of policymaking, and the times where they showed political courage you can count on one hand. So the idea that they're going to take this and then suddenly start imposing rate regulations is just absurd.
I mean, the FCC wouldn't even be running amok. I mean, at the very, very best, it might be slowly shuffling along with a walker amok.
Yeah, that's about as close.
Because I mean, it takes how long to do anything?
Yeah. I mean, this restoration of net neutrality will take another year. I'm sure 6 months to a year to get it through the process and the public comment process. And by that point, that's another, from the start of the Trump FCC era to now, that's 7 to 8 years with the FCC has not really done its job. In terms of consumer protection.
But how can they protect what they don't know? Because another major failing of the FCC, and when it comes to net neutrality and ISPs, has been their mapping system.
Oh my God, yeah. The FCC's maps. They're supposedly improving them. They've made some strides in improving them, but they still overstate competition and coverage, and they don't discuss price. The FCC absolutely refuses to collect data and share data on broadband pricing, which is essential for consumers and the press and policymakers to understand where market failure is happening. You could clearly, if they did the map properly, you would clearly not only see the big gaps in broadband coverage, you would see how price in this town is higher than 5 miles west where there's more competition. That data would be damning to them. So they fought, big telecom has fought tooth and nail against more accurate mapping data. Now they've put on a good token showing here because they want to gobble up this $42 billion in broadband infrastructure money that's rolling down the road here. So they've kind of said, all right, we'll do a little bit of mapping reform, but they still, if we had accurate maps, this wouldn't even be a debate.
Well, most of the maps are probably about as accurate as this background here behind me, as far as it goes. I mean,
yeah. Vague understanding of where broadband is. I mean, you can't fix a problem you don't measure or understand. That's just the foundational truth. And the FCC doesn't truly understand where broadband gaps are. So it can't fix a problem. And it doesn't even want to admit there's a problem half the time. So it's thorny. Part of the federal government's apathy and dysfunction has shifted most of the activism and policymaking to local fights. So everything now in broadband is a local fight, town fight, block to block. Let's get this problem fixed block to block. Let's build our own broadband network. We'll just fix this here, and whatever happens later happens. And that's a direct result of the apathy at the FCC. That is a direct result of policy failure in the federal government in terms of telecom communications policy.
Yeah. I mean, my local congressman, for instance, big Trump supporter, big Ajit Pai supporter, big net neutrality is bad and everything else like that. But when it comes to his newsletters, hey, I've got this broadband subsidy. It's going to put out local rural broadband for this part. 'Cause I'm in a very rural part of Georgia. I'm in the kind of southwest of Atlanta area, and that whole thing. But yeah, my congressman Drew Ferguson, I'll say it out loud, he is a very big hypocrite when it comes to that he doesn't want any kind of large scale, I want to say, investigation spotlight. Doesn't want high intensity spotlight on the ISPs or to enforcement, but he'd love to get them to have their local cash given out to them, say, hey, I brought this money to this district to give you this connection that you already paid for 17 times over with your taxes. By the way, lower taxes.
They get to have their cake and eat it too. They get to argue that you don't want government meddling in a beautiful broadband free market, because that'll destroy all the innovation. You don't want net neutrality because that'll stop Comcast from being an innovative and amazing little pony. But it's just not. It's not a free market. It's not a free market. It's a market dominated by natural monopolies. And when you eliminate any government oversight, in addition to no competition, the end result is monopoly abuse. It's obvious. It's documentable. There's plenty of data, and yet the conversation that we have in the press and in policy circles still doesn't touch on that fact. So I get frustrated, having covered this for 20 years, and retread all these debates.
And Business Daddy still hasn't given you a job, and I offered you a nice job as a lobbyist. Would you
No.
take it if they did?
No, I couldn't. No, I still have ethics.
Good. That's the right answer.
It's very uncharacteristic of me to have ethics in the year 2023, but I couldn't make that transition. It means I will retire at 80 and probably have to live off of SpaghettiOs from whatever I was managed to save from my journalism salary, but I can't. No, I would be an effective weapon for them if they wanted to hire me, but I couldn't do it ethically. It just would be impossible.
I say that is the right answer, and we need a lot more people like you. Not just saying, what about an FCC commissioner post? Would you take that up?
I wouldn't survive the nomination process, so I wouldn't bother. I mean, we just saw what happened to Gigi Sohn. I don't know how closely you followed her recent attempted confirmation. Yeah. She's super popular. She's super smart. She understands these issues better than anybody. She has diverse experience in both the FCC and consumer protection. But because she's a reformer, she got immediately smeared by industry in a very coordinated, very nasty 6 months to a year attack process that basically soured some of the centrist Democrats on pushing her through. It's very hard to get a real reformer at this agency. It would be impossible for someone like me. Impossible. Gigi's got history and connections that I would never have. I would last all of 5 seconds if they put me up for a post like that, because that's just these are the people that succeed to be appointed to this FCC are careerists who are non-controversial as possible, who keep their opinions on policy as vague and nebulous as possible. It's good to talk. They like to talk vaguely about how to bridge the digital divide, but they can't acknowledge that monopolies are a major reason that digital divide still exists. So I wouldn't survive the nomination process, and I think I'd go insane being like a minority vote commissioner on an agency that on a good day lacks the courage to take tough stands on issues of important policy. I think my job is basically to observe things I know to be factually true from 20 years of experience and try to communicate that complicated stuff in a digestible way to the public. That's how I see my role. And I try to do it the best I can.
Well, you say non-controversial stuff, but then you get people like Brendan Carr, who, let's face it, he's had some pretty out there theories and statements and stuff. He's not exactly non-controversial.
No.
Maybe it's the you're just on the wrong side of the aisle. You're on the wrong side of.
Well, you can be as controversial as you want if you're a right winger. You can't be controversial and be like a reformer. Those are. Yeah. He's got the backing of industry to be as controversial as he likes, and his controversy involves things like hyperventilating about TikTok when his job is to regulate telecom. He doesn't even have anything to do with social media. The agency doesn't regulate social media. It can't by law, which is an irony of its own, considering these are the same people that said the FCC lacked the authority to pass net neutrality rules. Carr basically spends most of his time. Both of the Republican FCC commissioners spend most of their time waging culture war type issues. They don't actually regulate telecom. They don't care about monopoly power. They don't care about the impact that monopoly power has on pricing. They just don't. You can look through their, this week when we talked about net neutrality, one of the commissioners, Nathan Symington, who was a Trump FCC appointee, he came out with a long missive about how net neutrality is actually a secret plan by big tech to censor conservatives, which is illogical, nonsensical gibberish. And it's
literally the opposite.
No, it hasn't. It's nonsense, and it gets treated in the press as if that's a real meaningful position. I don't even understand what some of these folks are doing in public office, quite honestly, because they have no interest in doing their actual job. So, yeah, I could go on about that at great length, but I won't bore you with it.
Well, so we talk about problems stuff. What about some kind of solutions? What would be your thoughts then, perhaps, on the US broadband network being kind of nationalized or consolidated into one company under a somewhat nationalized system, a bit like BT Openreach in the UK with local loop unbundling?
I don't think the argument is without merit, but it would be politically impossible to accomplish in this country at this particular moment. Unless we saw a massive voter sea change that drove centrist Democrats and Republicans out of office, I don't think that you would ever have the votes to make anything like that even close to a reality. which is why I think the real fight now is a very local one. And where I see the most optimism right now, as somebody who's tracked the telecom and broadband industry, is in community broadband. It's in the building of these local networks by municipalities, either directly through the municipality, through a cooperative, through a city-owned utility. Pretty much every week I talk to a different city that's trying to navigate ways to build more affordable access for their residents after 20 years of being neglected by monopolies. So if there's optimism to be found, it's the fact that I see a lot of local grassroots bipartisan support for these networks. Contrary to the framing in the national media, a lot of this has bipartisan support. Chattanooga, Tennessee offers some of the fastest, cheapest tiers in the country. That's in the middle of a red state. A lot of conservative states have pretty successful municipal broadband networks. That's my optimism comes through local activism. My optimism comes through the local equity groups that are having a real impact in towns all over the country. I don't have any optimism left in terms of the federal government. It's exhausted it. Having covered this beat for 22 years, that optimism is gone. It's been burned out of me. When I have optimism, it comes from local activism. Finally, these people are finally building concrete solutions to monopoly power block by block, often at great personal cost and expense. But that's where I get optimistic. I think broadband policy fights are local now. I think the federal government has shown it's not capable of meaningful consumer protection. So a lot of that responsibility has shifted to state attorneys general, who are understaffed and underfunded to tackle it. But that's the reality. And that's, it's very hard for a monopoly like Comcast to combat every single town in the United States simultaneously. It was very easy for them to lobby the federal government into apathy. It was relatively simple for them to lobby state legislatures into apathy, but it's a totally different animal when you've got thousands of towns filled with pissed off people who've been struggling to afford broadband access for 30 straight years. That's a hard reform to conquer, and they're going to have a hard time with having the same success that they saw on the federal level. So yeah, that's where my optimism sits, is locally. And I think broadband is reflective of many other things in this country. I don't think it's just telecom where you're going to be seeing that. As the Supreme Court tries to defang regulators, whether it's safety regulators, telecom regulators, consumer protection, environmental regulators, you're going to see fights shift increasingly to local, fighting locally and then fighting outward. I think that's the trajectory of this country. And I think it will be for the next 10 to 20 years until we see some kind of meaningful sea change in the public awareness of the fact that they're electing buffoons and compromised, corrupt marionettes, to be polite.
Yeah. But there has been some fight back at the state level. I mean, you mentioned Chattanooga. Despite that being a long-running, hugely successful, hugely popular, I've got a friend who lives there as a local radio DJ and a publisher there who's raved about it for decades and stuff. The Tennessee state government still tried to basically ban and block any cities from even starting them at the state level.
Yeah,
and
I think there are
one of the people behind that was, of course, Marsha Blackburn. She's one of the biggest champions for it. Now she's in the Senate, and has been pushing it.
Pretending to support the digital divide after passing legislation that monopolies wrote that basically block towns from expanding their own broadband networks. I think around 17. It's dropped in the last few years. I think there's about 17 states that have passed legislation that's usually ghost written by telecom monopolies that block your town or city from being able to build its own broadband network. Either block it outright or make it impossible to finance, even if voters approve it. COVID was a real crash course for a lot of people in terms of affordable access, with everybody suddenly trying to get their kids to school online and telecommuting themselves. The quality of broadband became a real hot topic there for a while. So that really changed things. And I think Washington State, Arkansas, and it might be another one that I'm forgetting, dropped their restrictions on community broadband because they're finally realizing that, all right, enough of this. This is a solution. This works. We can do this. If we design a plan properly and get financing that works. Plus, so many of these towns are taking advantage of a fairly historic amount of broadband subsidies coming from both the COVID Recovery Act and the infrastructure bill. Between the two of those, we're talking more than $50 billion in broadband subsidies. Now, the lion's share of that money is still going to go to telecom monopolies like Comcast, because that's the system we've built. But a lot of it is also going to city-owned utilities and cooperatives and municipalities that are building affordable fiber networks with gigabit service for $60 a month.
Gimme.
Yeah, I would like that too. So that's the trend we're on. I think you're going to see a lot of fraud from these subsidy awards, because the government, of course, is really bad at monitoring and make sure it's spent correctly. But I also think you're going to see a lot of amazing networks pop up all over the country that will continue to shine a light on how this is possible. It is possible to fight back against these companies on a local level. It's practical, it's possible, and you can fund it. If you take advantage of the BEAD funding coming from the broadband infrastructure bill that's starting to wind out, it's been possible for many of these towns for the first time ever financially. So that's where my optimism again, I think, will pop up.
Well, we're coming towards the end here, but Karl, is there any one or two things that you'd like to say to people out there that, if they want to help support and make things better? What should they be looking for? What should they do? What should their activism be pointed at right now, in your opinion?
Pay attention to local politics. I know it's frustrating. We've just navigated one of the ugliest political periods in probably this country's history, but it's important to pay attention to local politics, because that's where you can still make change. Get involved. Go to your local city council meetings. Show support if they propose a well-conceived community broadband plan. Go to the town hall and show your support. Write these politicians that you appreciate what they're doing. That makes a difference. Just stay informed and pay for decent journalism. If there's a journalist whose work you like and they have a newsletter, subscribe to it. Because the press needs all the help it can get right now.
Yeah, I hear that. You hear that? Yeah. A lot of the problem with the state, the way the state's become the way it's become, is because the journalism isn't there for the honest, in-depth.
Yeah, we gutted most local quality journalism. Yeah, it's been a pretty substantive effort to gut local journalism and create this kind of homogenized mass of bland coverage that doesn't really get into the nitty-gritty, which I think really allows corruption to thrive on local, which we can change if we pay attention, and support real reporting.
Yeah, especially because a lot of subject matter experts like you have been kind of lured by the just the need to be able to pay to put food on the table into lobbyist positions against the very topics they were covering.
Yeah. At worst, or just driven out of news coverage entirely. I've lost track of the number of colleagues at major tech news publications that have lost their jobs in the last 2 years. So support local journalism. Pay attention to your local school board meetings. Pay attention to your local city council meetings. Show your active support to people who are doing quality journalism and quality reform policy. I think it's possible to
be smart and pay attention.
Yeah, exactly. So,
all right. Well, Karl, it's been a pleasure to see you. A pleasure to have you on. A pleasure to have spent the last hour discussing this wonderful, deep, and for both of us, it's been a very involved and long road, involved topic. And
again,
I appreciate you joining us.
I appreciate you having me. It's been nice to talk to you.
So, where can people find you on the net?
You can find just do a Google. You'll find me. I'm over at Blue Sky. I'm talking on there. You can find my work at Tech Dirt. You can find my work around the internet. I hope to launch a newsletter pretty soon. Yeah.
All right. Well, I say, Karl, it's been wonderful having you, and have a good evening.
Thank you. You too.
And so that brings us to the end of this episode of Tetch Talk. If you've enjoyed this episode, then please do hit, like and subscribe if you haven't already. Helps me out and gives me indication to keep producing these. Also, coming up is a FCC meeting on net neutrality. So if you're reading this, watching this, listening to this soon after, please do get in touch with the FCC. Let them know your feelings on it, and let your representatives, as Karl says, at the local level as well as at the state and national level, let them know how important net neutrality is to you and how we can improve our broadband infrastructure by, getting rid of this monopoly situation and not, paying for it over and over again as we have been doing. But until next time, I want to thank you all for watching. Take care, and I'll see you next time.